Hi there. My name is Damien and I work at YouthWorks, a social enterprise media production company in Brunswick, Victoria. We offer certified training and employment for young people who are at risk of homelessness and disengagement from education. We help them to gain meaningful skills, experience and employment in the media production world. There's an old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that is so true. Photography has been used throughout its history to help inform, shape and change society in many ways. War photographers show us what it's like on the front line of conflicts. One of the most well-known images of the Vietnam War is the innocent young girl running down the road naked, having been burned by napalm. Images like that helped hammer home the pain and futility of conflict and helped end that war. Environmental activists in the 1970s used images of the Franklin River in Tasmania to show the broader public how beautiful the area was and how it shouldn't be dammed. It's still a pristine natural area now thanks to those images. But photography doesn't need to be of big and grand subject matters to make a difference. It could be as simple as showing the humanity of people through simple portraiture, or a photo of a group marching for their rights in the inner city. No matter what you're shooting though, the important things to consider are, what are you trying to say? And does your photograph best show this? If not, how can you improve the quality of your shots? Photography is like any form of communication. It needs to make sense and have a clear point. And this is especially important when creating impactful visual stories. So that's what this module will help you to achieve. In this module, we'll be covering things such as using smartphones and inexpensive equipment because we're all on a budget. Lighting, composition and framing, some photographic features of a smartphone camera you might not know about, things to consider when shooting for social impact, the differences between styles of photography, portraiture versus event photography versus documentary style photography, and some simple in-phone editing techniques. So let's get into it. To start with, let's look at your equipment. Most people won't have access to a fancy SLR camera, that's worth $4,000. And to be honest, you won't need it. Smartphone cameras have gotten so good in a number of ways that they're excellent at doing the job you need, especially the newer models. The best camera is the one you have on you. Also, using a smartphone means less time needed to process your shots and you can upload them to social media quickly. None of that post-processing lag that you have to get with the big cameras. So we're going to be working on the principle that that's what you'll be using, a smartphone. But most of what we'll be discussing here can also be used when shooting with an SLR. Features of a smartphone camera. So, smartphone camera, there are some things you might not know about. You might just be used to holding your phone up and clicking the button and there you go, there's your photo. It's all set to automatic. There are some things in here, and don't get me wrong, that works perfectly well. But there are some options in here if you want to have more control over what is being lit or the exposure or the focus. So if you go into your camera, so there's my camera. Oh, it's actually on selfie mode. Let's turn that off. So there's my camera. So you might not realize this, but you can actually manually adjust the focus or what is in focus and the exposure. So to do that, you would just press, so for focus and exposure, you would just touch on the screen. And you'll find that your camera will focus to whatever it is that you're touching. And also will expose to the light levels in that section. If you wanted to control that even more, if you touch it, you will generally find there's a slider that pops up. On Samsung, it's a plus and a minus with like a light bulb, and I can slide up and down. Up to the plus makes it brighter, slide down to the minus makes it darker. And then if, for example, you wanted to lock that focus or that exposure, you press and you hold. And what will happen is an option pops up, there'll be like a circle or something and it says AF/AE lock. So what that's done is actually locked your exposure and your focus to that point. So you can move your camera around and the exposure won't automatically adjust and the focus won't automatically adjust. It'll lock itself. So that can be handy. Next, I would turn on what we call HDR mode. Now HDR mode is if you go into your camera, so usually there'll be an option somewhere on the screen that says HDR and it'll either be on or off. Now HDR, what that does is it takes a shot of, basically takes 3 photos in one time. It takes a low exposure, a high exposure, and a middle exposure, and it combines the two. So anything that is dark, it brightens. Anything that's bright, it darkens, and it makes a nice sort of even exposure. That can be really handy if like you're a bit of a rush and you don't have the time. It just also means that it will help sort of get some of them darker bits out, and the overexposed bits, it'll help bring some detail back into them. Another option too, like if you have the opportunity and you've got, say, a whole bunch of space on your phone, and you don't know, let's say like let's say you're at a march and there's like heaps going on, and you click, 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 click. What you can do is you can actually hold down your shutter button, and it will do what's called a burst shoot. And that takes like one shot after the other, like in really quick succession. Like you might get like 20 shots in a second, 2 seconds. I might be exaggerating, but it takes a lot of photos all at once. So you can then go through later on and go pick. There might be a really good shot of someone like marching and putting their arm up and go, oh, and that will you'll capture that one really good shot of that, and you can use that. There are also things called like filters, which filters will they change the coloring, they change the effect. It might give you like a 70s look, or black and white or something like that. There are some limitations to smartphones though. The main one that you will actually really notice quite quickly is zoom. On a smartphone, don't zoom. Okay, so when you're in your camera, how you can pinch and zoom in and zoom out? Don't do that, because what that does, it actually doesn't zoom the lens. It just zooms the pixels. So your pixels are actually just getting bigger. So that's why it becomes quite grainy and murky and doesn't look very good. If you need to zoom, get closer. Actually physically move the camera closer to your subject. That's really important, because then you'll have the highest amount of quality for your shots, and you're not making it grainy and look terrible. There are also other things. So they have a smaller sensor, so that the camera sensor is smaller than, say, in a big SLR, so it doesn't record as much information, but that shouldn't be too much of an issue if you're just sharing to things like social media or email or digital. Other options or other issues is sometimes smartphones can struggle in lighting, poor lighting. If it's really dark, your images might look really grainy. Some color distortions and stuff. People look quite sort of splotchy and stuff. That's just because the camera is it makes its sensor more sensitive to light, and that will make our grain go big and clunky. So try and stick to well lit areas if you can. If that's not possible, work with what you got. And also the other key thing I can't recommend enough, is cleaning your lens. So this little lens here on the back of your camera gets real dirty real easy, because fingers are all over, it's in your pocket, it's getting lint on it, whatever. So just grab a soft bit of material, like it might be a t-shirt or something, and just gently clean the front of your lens. Take any fingerprints off it, because there's nothing worse than a photo that looks like it's got like Vaseline smeared on the front because it's all fingerprinty. Okay, so and then the final point is our orientation of our camera. So default, most people pull their camera out, and when they take a photo, they hold it upright. Okay, so you're like that. That's fine, but just consider that maybe the better shot is actually going landscape. So you go, put it on its side and shoot that way. If you're taking photos of people, portrait's okay. If you're taking photos of groups, go landscape style. Taking a shot of a city or something, go like that. Just depending on your situation, just keep that in mind. Because the default is most people just don't even think. They just pull it out and start shooting. That's why you see so many videos on social media where they've taken a photo and it looks like that. Lighting is very important in photography, because if there's no light, there's no image. Or if there's too much light, there's also no image. A lot of cameras struggle in poor lighting conditions, and a smartphone isn't any exception. Different situations will call for different lighting, and your camera has to work well in all of them. For example, let's say you're shooting an event indoors, and it's different than shooting a portrait series, for example. An indoor event like a presentation will generally involve 1 or 2 spotlights on a speaker up at a dais, throwing really strong light onto them, causing harsh shadows to form on their face. The crowd, on the other hand, will probably be poorly lit and be quite dark. If you need to shoot the crowd, maybe you want to show the number, people who are there. You may need to do it while the house lights are up, or take a chances that your camera can expose correctly for the darkened room. To shoot the speaker, you need to make sure that the lit areas of the face are not overexposed. Use your newly learned exposure controls on the phone, and that you can get some detail in the shadows. A way to do this is to use a HDR setting on your camera. Events you may not have much control of in regard to the lighting, but you can get some nice dramatic shots with that strong lighting, and the effectiveness of your shots will come down more to your composition and framing. Lighting someone for a portrait shot, on the other hand, depends on what you're trying to say. You can have more control here. If you're after a moody shot with strong shadows, consider using a single source of light like a lamp. Move the light around till you're happy with the look, then expose for the lit area, and shoot. If you're after softer, more even lighting, consider shooting beside a nice big window, like I'm doing right here, or under the shade of a tree or building. Just make sure the sun isn't hitting a subject directly, as that will just cause harsh shadows and contrast. Indirect lighting is great for portrait shots, and to be honest, it's great for most photographic situations. If you can avoid strong, harsh shadows, unless that's specifically what you're after, then you should really try to. Also, avoid using flash if you can, especially on a camera phone. It's pretty ineffectual, and even if it does work, it'll make your subject look flat and lifeless. But remember, you've got to work with what you have. Once you've figured out how to use your camera and you've discovered what it can do, you've sussed out your lighting situation, the next step is how to compose your shots. This is where you really start telling a story. When you compose your shot, you are considering how to arrange all of your visual elements, people, shapes, colors, lines, etc., in your photo. Smartphones can't really blur out things in the background, so everything will be in focus. So arranging your elements is super important. A good basic to start from is something called the rule of thirds. If you look in the settings of your camera app, you should find an option for something called grid. Turn that on. What it does is it overlays your screen with a 3x3 grid, and you can use this to line things up with to help make better composed images. Some of the benefits of this grid, are they help keep your lines and horizons straight. Nothing more annoying than having a well-lit shot let down by an off-kilter horizon. You can line things up with the lines, crossing points to make a well-balanced image. The human brain really likes this. It works for almost all situations, portraits, events, landscapes, etc. It's just a rule though, not a law. It doesn't have to be followed. Anything that is important to your image should be lined up with either the horizontal or the vertical lines, or where the lines of your grid cross. These crossing points are referred to as power points. Have a look online for a stack of examples of images taken using the rule of thirds. When you compose your images, keep in mind what you want your view to be focusing on. This doesn't mean that you place the subject smack bang in the middle of your frame, because that can be boring, lack imagination, and usually won't look good at all. But it does mean consider the things around the subject. Is there a noisy background that's taken away from your subject? Is there a different angle you could be shooting from? Is the subject facing the right way? Are there bits of your subject that are being cut off in your shot accidentally? When you're shooting portraits, consider how your subject is sitting or standing. Are they straight onto the camera, like a target? Not a great look. Are they looking directly down the lens? This can be confronting and intimidating. Are they looking off camera? Are they coming across as strong or weak? Are you making the most of their best features? Shooting from a slightly elevated position can help a face look more pleasant and drop below the chins, whereas shooting from a low vantage point can be very unflattering and make it stick out. And an extremely low or high vantage point can make the subject look weak or domineering. Make sure you're telling the best visual story you can. Another thing to consider is the orientation of your camera. Portrait upright or landscape on its side. What works best for your situation? The default that most people fall into is portrait, as that's how most people use their phones. So it becomes habit. Keep that in mind and be conscious of what works best for your shot. You need to be really mindful of shooting for social impact, because you're telling a visual story and you don't want your message to be misinterpreted. As mentioned earlier, the vantage point and how you frame your subject can have a huge impact on how they're received. For example, let's say you're shooting a speaker at an event. It's a dark space and they're lit by a single spotlight. And they're up on a raised stage and you're shooting from below. Already visually, they're in a dominant position, a position of strength and power. Add in the hard lighting and it's added a sense of drama, and visually can be quite intimidating. Now let's decide that the shot you choose is one where the speaker is looking right down the lens. Okay, it's right at the viewer. That's an intimidating, powerful image. Now let's say that this image is meant to be going with a great uplifting story about how philanthropy can be used for positive social impact. It doesn't gel, does it? There's a dissonance between the written story and the visual story. And sometimes the visual stories are more important because it's the picture that will capture a person's attention first. Something else you may need to keep in mind is that you might be shooting something or someone of a sensitive nature. Maybe you're documenting the plight of a refugee or a survivor of family violence, and you're wanting to incorporate some visual imagery into your story, but the person doesn't wish to be identified. Consider getting creative. Maybe a close-up shot of their hands showing all the creases and details, or a close-up shot of a personal item, or shoot them from behind. Think about your composition though when considering this. Most phones have a basic editing app built in. It might be an option when you open up your image in a gallery app. But if you've done a good job in composing your shots, then you probably won't need to do much post-production. Usually I try to keep it simple. 1. Crop and reframe. Cropping is when you reframe and take parts out of your image, like you make it a bit smaller, like you might have a big gap here. Maybe you've got too much dead space on this side, so you want to make your subject take up more space. Or maybe your horizon is a little wonky and you want to straighten it by rotating the image a little. Cropping and reframing is great because just this simple act can help strengthen the focus in your image and change the story completely. Just be aware not to take too much out of the picture. You only have a limited number of pixels to play with. So the more you crop, the smaller your image actually becomes. Saturation is another one. Is the strength of the color in your image. Do you want to add more color or do I want to take color out? A black and white image can be very powerful and help remove unwanted background noise. On the flip side, if you're trying to capture the vibrancy of something, like let's say a cultural festival, you'll want to punch up the saturation of the colors just a little bit. Just remember, it's very easy to go overboard and make an image go from really nice to my eyes, they're bleeding, by messing with the saturation too much. A little goes a long way. Contrast. So this is the difference between the light and the dark in your image. High contrast means that there's a lot of really bright tones and a lot of really dark tones, but not much in the way of the mid-tones between. Imagine a film noir detective movie. Low contrast means there's a lot of mid-tones and not much on either end. This can look quite murky and lose details in the shot. Filters. These are special coloring effects that we put into your image to invoke a certain feel. For example, do you want your image to look like something taken in the 70s on a color film camera? Easy. There's a filter for that. Want it to look like a film noir detective movie? There's a filter for that. These can be really handy, but they can also be really easy to overuse. With all these editing options, it's about thinking what it is you're trying to visually say and using them in moderation. If you're using the editing options as a way to cover a poor shot, retake the shot. It will make you a better photographer in the long run. Apps like Instagram and Facebook have their own options for photo editing as well, and I encourage you to explore these, as well as exploring your own camera app on your phone. The best bit of advice I can give you though is to practice. Practice, 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 and practice some more. Like, you always have your phone with you, which means you always have a camera with you. So keep shooting, keep exploring. Thanks.